I am Cassidy, 33 years old, standing in the middle of my climate-controlled hydroponic greenhouse breathing in the scent of damp earth and growing things. My hands were covered in soil inspecting the root system of a rare heirloom tomato plant when my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID flashed Sylvia, my mother. We hadn't spoken in nearly 8 months, not since she pointedly failed to invite me to her annual country club gala, claiming she only had room at her table for established professionals, meaning my brother Bradley and his latest string of failed business partners. I wiped my hands on my apron, a familiar tightening in my chest, and answered. The words she spoke didn't just cross a line, they attempted to obliterate the life I had built from the ground up over the last 3 years. She called to tell me that my father Thomas, who passed away 4 years ago, had made a grave error in his will. An error she was now correcting. She claimed she possessed a newly discovered signed document transferring the deed of the upstate New York land he had left me directly to my brother Bradley. I had exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before Bradley arrived to take over what was rightfully his. You have been playing in the dirt for 3 years, Cassidy. Sylvia said, her voice dripping with the familiar icy condescension that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. It is time for a real businessman to take over. That pathetic little shack your father left you is an eyesore, but Bradley thinks he can flip the land to developers. Pack your bags, leave the keys under the mat. She didn't wait for a response before disconnecting the call. The silence in the greenhouse was deafening, save for the low hum of the irrigation system. She thought I was living in the rotting, collapsed hunting cabin my father had originally purchased decades ago. She thought I was still the scapegoat, the failure, the daughter who had dropped out of college and disappeared into the woods. She had absolutely no idea what I had been doing for the past 3 years. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. The timid girl who used to desperately seek her approval was long gone. Instead, I pulled up a map application on my phone, dropped a pin on my exact location, and texted the GPS coordinates to Bradley's number. The message was simple: come and get it. My father's will had been a shock to everyone. When he died, he left the bulk of his estate, including the luxury penthouse in Manhattan, and the family investment portfolios to Sylvia, under the stipulation that she manage Bradley's trust. To me, he left 50 acres of supposedly barren, worthless land in the Hudson Valley, complete with a dilapidated shack that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 1980s. Sylvia and Bradley had laughed at the reading of the will. I remember Bradley leaning over, whispering that I could finally live out my dream of being a hermit since I clearly wasn't cut out for the real world. They didn't know that my father and I had shared a secret. He knew what lay beneath that soil, and he knew I was the only one with the grit to bring it to the surface. Now, 3 years later, Bradley was finally coming to claim his prize. I walked out of the greenhouse and stood on the expansive cedar deck, waiting. 2 hours later, a massive, obnoxious lifted rental truck came roaring up the long, winding gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the pristine landscaping. Bradley slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly. He stepped out of the truck wearing a designer suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the Catskill Mountains, holding a leather briefcase like a weapon. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash whatever arrogant tirade he had rehearsed on the drive up from the city, but the words died in his throat. He stood there, mouth ajar, his eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. He wasn't looking at a rotting shack or an overgrown, neglected plot of land. He was staring at the haven. Over the past 3 years, I had transformed those 50 acres into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar eco-luxury resort. The main lodge, built from sustainably sourced timber and glass, reflected the afternoon sun. Surrounding it were a dozen private luxury cabins, each with a panoramic view of the valley, a world-class farm-to-table restaurant, supplied entirely by my organic gardens, and a natural mineral spring spa that currently had a 6-month waiting list. It was a haven for elite clientele seeking a sustainable retreat, and it was entirely mine. Bradley's gaze swept from the gleaming solar panels on the roof of the main lodge to the manicured pathways winding through the property, finally landing on me, standing calmly on the deck. The shock on his face rapidly morphed into a dark, ugly confusion, and then inevitably into rage. This wasn't the easy eviction he had planned. He wasn't here to kick his loser sister out of a shack. He was standing in the middle of an empire and he was about to try and take it. The shock on his face only lasted for a few seconds. The surprise quickly melted into an ugly, aggressive entitlement. Bradley had always believed everything in the world belonged to him, and seeing this level of wealth only triggered his overwhelming greed. He slammed the door of his rental truck and stormed up the wide stone steps. He ignored the polite greeting from the valet and pushed roughly past a couple wearing thick white spa robes. He marched right into the center of the elegant lobby. The space was usually quiet and peaceful, filled with soft ambient music and the calming scent of lavender and eucalyptus. Bradley shattered that peace instantly. His muddy leather shoes left tracks across the polished stone floors. He marched up to the custom-carved wood reception desk and slammed his fist down hard enough to make the computer monitors shake. He demanded that the staff bring him the manager immediately. He pointed to his chest and yelled that he was the new owner of this entire property and everyone worked for him now. Guests turned their heads in shock, pausing their quiet conversations. My front desk manager looked terrified, but remained professional, trying to calm him down. I watched the entire embarrassing spectacle from the second-floor interior balcony for a moment before I began slowly walking down the grand, sweeping staircase. Bradley spotted me descending the stairs, and his face turned bright red with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me and started screaming accusations in front of the entire lobby. He yelled that I was a complete fraud. He told the guests that there was no way a pathetic college dropout could ever afford to build a place like this on her own. He accused me of money laundering and illegal activities right in the middle of my own business. He screamed that I must have stolen the money to fund this resort. I reached the bottom of the stairs and motioned for my two head security guards to step forward. They were large, imposing men in dark suits who immediately flanked me, placing themselves between me and my out-of-control brother. I stood tall and looked my brother dead in the eye. My voice was calm and perfectly steady, but loud enough for every wealthy guest in the lobby to hear clearly. I dropped out of college because I had to work double shifts at a diner. I said the words ringing clearly through the silent room. I had to work those exhausting shifts to pay off the $50,000 credit card debt you racked up when you stole my social security number. You ruined my credit to fund your partying and your gambling habits, brother. Do not ever talk to me about how I fund my life. Bradley flinched, physically stepping back. Several guests gasped out loud at the revelation. The humiliation was written all over his red face, but he was too arrogant to back down. His greed completely took over his common sense. He reached inside his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a thick folded piece of heavy paper. He waved it in the air, making sure everyone could see the bright red county seal stamped at the bottom. He sneered at me with a look of pure triumph, thinking he had the ultimate winning hand. Dad signed this power of attorney before he died. Bradley yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I own every single inch of this land. You are trespassing on my multi-million-dollar property right now, and I am calling the police to have you thrown out in handcuffs. The heavy silence in the grand lobby was shattered by the sharp click of designer heels against the polished stone floor. Before I could instruct my security team to escort my raving brother off the property, the massive glass entrance doors slid open to reveal a sleek black Cadillac Escalade idling in the valet lane. My mother Sylvia stepped into the lobby. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized sunglasses, looking every bit the entitled matriarch she desperately wanted the world to believe she was. She paused just inside the doorway, lowering her sunglasses to take in the vaulted timber ceilings, the custom art installations, and the affluent guests whispering in the lounge areas. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, registering the undeniable wealth of the haven, before her expression hardened into a mask of smug satisfaction. Walking a few paces behind her was Kendra, Bradley's wife. I had only met Kendra a handful of times, but I respected her. She was a brilliant 32-year-old African-American woman who had worked her way up to become a senior corporate auditor at a top accounting firm in Manhattan. Unlike Sylvia and Bradley, who operated purely on delusion and entitlement, Kendra lived in the world of facts, ledgers, and hard evidence. Right now, her sharp eyes were darting rapidly across the lobby, taking in the commercial-grade infrastructure, the high-end security system, and the sheer scale of the operation. She looked deeply unsettled. Sylvia completely ignored the tense standoff between Bradley, myself, and my security guards. Instead, she marched straight up to my front desk manager. She snapped her manicured fingers twice in the young woman's face. "Have the valet unload the Escalade immediately," Sylvia commanded, her voice carrying easily across the cavernous room. "Bring my luggage to the VIP suite, the one with the best view of the valley, and have a bottle of chilled vintage champagne waiting for me. I have had a tremendously exhausting drive." My manager froze, her eyes darting toward me for instruction. I gave a barely perceptible nod, signaling her to play along. I wanted them to feel entirely comfortable in the trap they were building for themselves. Kendra walked up beside her husband. She gripped Bradley's arm, her voice low but urgent enough that I could hear every word. "Bradley, what is going on here? You told me your father left you an abandoned hunting shack with a massive tax lien. You said we were driving up here to evaluate an empty plot of dirt for a quick cash sale. This is a fully operational luxury resort. It takes years of commercial zoning, environmental impact studies, and tens of millions in capital to build a hospitality enterprise of this scale. What legal document are you actually waving around?" Bradley yanked his arm out of his wife's grasp. His face flushed a dark, angry red as he immediately pivoted to aggressive defense. "Do not question me in front of these people, Kendra." He leaned in, pointing an accusing finger at me while speaking to his wife. "My psychotic sister is a master manipulator. She knew our father was losing his mind in his final years. She isolated him, drained his secret offshore accounts, and used his money to build this place right under our noses. She laundered his life savings to steal my inheritance." Kendra recoiled, her professional instincts screaming that his story made absolutely zero financial sense. "You cannot launder millions of dollars into a registered commercial property without leaving a massive paper trail." "Bradley," she fired back, her tone shifting from a concerned wife to a skeptical auditor. "If she used your father's money, the estate lawyers would have flagged the missing capital during probate. Nothing you are saying aligns with basic corporate finance." Bradley stepped aggressively into Kendra's personal space, using his physical size to intimidate her into silence. I said, "Drop it. I hold the power of attorney. I have the signed deed from the county clerk. I am the sole owner of this entire valley. You are either with me on this or you can find your own way back to the city. Keep your mouth shut and let me handle my thieving sister." Kendra looked physically ill. She took a slow step back from her husband, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She did not say another word, but her eyes locked onto me, calculating, searching for the truth hidden beneath her husband's manic outburst. Sylvia, entirely unbothered by the domestic dispute happening 2 feet away from her, finally turned her attention to me. She walked right up to the line of my security guards, stopping inches away from their broad chests. She looked at me with a mixture of profound disgust and predatory triumph. The elite guests in the lounge had stopped pretending to read their magazines. Every eye in the lobby was fixed on our family drama. Sylvia thrived on having an audience. "You really thought you could get away with this?" Sylvia said, her voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could run off into the woods, steal your brother's birthright, and play the successful CEO. You are exactly the same deceitful, bitter girl you were in high school. But the game is over, Cassidy. The adults are here to take charge of the finances." She reached into her oversized designer tote bag. The rustling sound of plastic echoed loudly in the tense silence of the lobby. She pulled out a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag. With a theatrical flick of her wrist, she snapped the trash bag open and tossed it directly at my feet. It landed with a soft, insulting thud against the polished stone. "Pack your miserable little life and get out!" Sylvia ordered, her voice echoing clearly for every wealthy guest and staff member to hear. "You always were the help. Always." The black plastic trash bag settled against the polished travertine floor with a dull, heavy thud. The entire grand lobby of the Haven went completely still. High net worth guests paused with their expensive champagne flutes suspended halfway to their lips. The valet staff stood frozen by the towering glass entrance doors. Sylvia crossed her arms over her pristine white cashmere coat, her chin raised in absolute defiance, waiting for me to break down. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to lose my temper and look unstable in front of my own elite clientele so she could justify taking over the property. Bradley smirked from his position near the custom-carved reception desk, puffing out his chest like he had already won the war. Kendra stood silently behind them, her sharp auditor eyes watching my every move, clearly disturbed by the sheer cruelty of the spectacle. I looked down at the trash bag, then up at my mother. I did not scream. I did not call my security team to drag her out of the building. I calmly bent down and picked up the cheap plastic bag. "If that is what you want, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing clearly in the quiet room, "I hope you enjoy your stay." I turned my back on my family and walked purposefully toward the executive residential wing. Behind me, I could hear Bradley loudly declaring to the stunned guests that there was new management in town and drinks were on the house. I ignored his pathetic grandstanding. Entering my private suite, I bypassed the luxury amenities I had meticulously designed myself. I opened the trash bag and tossed in a few changes of practical work clothes, my heavy boots, and my encrypted backup hard drives. I grabbed a small leather duffel for my toiletries and my laptop. That was all I needed to run my empire. My general manager, Marcus, intercepted me in the hallway as I emerged from the suite. His face was pale with panic. He asked if he should dial the local police and have my family arrested for trespassing and creating a public disturbance. I shook my head, handing him my master override keycard. "No, Marcus," I told him. "You are not going to stop them. You are going to treat them like absolute royalty." I left the main lodge through a discreet service exit, avoiding the continuing circus in the front lobby. The late afternoon sun was casting long, deep shadows over the manicured lawns as I walked down a narrow gravel utility path. At the very edge of the property, hidden completely behind a dense, impenetrable line of towering pine trees, sat a small wooden maintenance cabin. It was originally built for groundskeepers decades ago. It was dusty, sparse, and furnished with only a simple cot, a battered wooden table, and a small space heater. I unlocked the heavy door, stepped inside the dim room, and tossed the trash bag onto the cot. It was a massive downgrade from my penthouse suite, but it was the perfect undetectable command center. I sat at the wooden table, opened my laptop, and dialed my lead attorney, Mitchell. He answered on the first ring. When I told him Bradley had shown up with a notarized power of attorney from my deceased father and claimed immediate ownership of the resort land, Mitchell nearly exploded over the phone. He demanded to immediately file an emergency court injunction to halt them from entering the premises or touching the business accounts. He reminded me that the ancient deed they held was utterly useless, given the complex corporate structure I had built over the last 3 years. I told Mitchell to stand down and file absolutely nothing. I explained that kicking them out now would only result in a messy, drawn-out family dispute in the local courts. I wanted them to feel invincible. I wanted them to take absolute unchecked control of the resort, because the moment they did, they assumed total legal and financial liability for their actions. Mitchell went completely silent on the other end of the line, realizing exactly the kind of trap I was orchestrating. He finally let out a low chuckle, agreeing to hold off on all legal filings until I gave the signal to strike. Next, I called Marcus back to establish the ground rules. I gave him strict, unbreakable orders regarding my mother and brother. I told Marcus to give them unlimited access to the resort amenities. If Sylvia wanted to invite her elite country club friends, comp their rooms, and demand exclusive use of the spa, he was to let her do it. If Bradley wanted to order the most expensive vintage wines from the reserve cellar for his buddies, Marcus was to pop the corks immediately. But I instructed my manager, "You must document every single transaction. Create a shadow ledger in the accounting system. Every comped meal, every stolen bottle of wine, every hour of staff time they waste on personal demands. Put it all on their tab." I wanted a legally binding receipt of their parasitic invasion. Night fell over the Hudson Valley, wrapping the maintenance cabin in total darkness. I did not turn on the lights. I sat by the small, smudged window, staring out at the perimeter of the resort. A few hours later, the quiet night was violently interrupted by the roar of a heavy-duty diesel engine. Headlights swept across the dark tree line. A massive battered pickup truck pulled up right to the edge of the ancient towering oak forest that bordered the western side of my property. Bradley stepped out of the passenger side, holding a bright flashlight and a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints. 4 men followed him out of the truck. They were not resort guests. They were rough, shady-looking contractors wearing dirty steel-toed boots and heavy work jackets. I cracked the cabin window open just a fraction to listen to their conversation. Bradley was pointing his flashlight at the massive, centuries-old oak trees. His arrogant voice carried easily through the crisp night air. He told the men that this entire section of woods was useless dead space. He loudly declared his grand business plan to clear-cut the entire forest rip, out the roots, and pour a massive concrete foundation for a private high-roller casino to cater to his new wealthy friends. The lead contractor crossed his arms and asked when he wanted to start the demolition. Bradley laughed, a harsh, greedy sound that echoed in the dark. He ordered the men to bring their heavy bulldozers and excavators at first light tomorrow morning and tear every single tree down. From the dark shadows of my hidden cabin, I watched them shake hands on the reckless deal. A slow, ice-cold smile spread across my face. Bradley thought he was acting like a ruthless real estate mogul, but he had absolutely no idea what that specific forest was legally classified as. He had just handed me the final devastating weapon I needed. The trap was locked. The morning sun barely crested the Catskill Mountains when the real invasion began. I sat at the battered wooden table inside my maintenance cabin, monitoring the resort's high-definition security feeds on my laptop. Bradley's bulldozers were already parked at the edge of the ancient oak forest, waiting for the ground to thaw, but my focus shifted entirely to the main driveway. A parade of glossy black town cars and silver Mercedes sedans rolled up to the grand entrance of the haven. Sylvia had summoned her royal court. Over a dozen women stepped out of the vehicles wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying bags that cost more than my first car. These were the elite members of Sylvia's country club. The same women who had spent my entire childhood looking at me as if I were a stain on the pristine rug of my mother's perfect life. They flowed into the lobby in a cloud of heavy floral perfume and loud, overlapping voices. Sylvia stood at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a flowing silk caftan, greeting them like a conquering monarch, welcoming her subjects to a newly captured palace. I keyed my radio, connecting directly to the earpiece of Marcus, my general manager. He was standing near the reception desk, watching the spectacle with tight lips. Give them the absolute highest level of service, Marcus, I instructed, my voice perfectly calm in the quiet of the cabin. Whatever they ask for, they receive. Just make sure the shadow ledger captures every single penny. Marcus gave a barely perceptible nod to the security camera and went to work. The takeover was swift and ruthless. Sylvia's friends swarmed the Natural Mineral Springs spa, displacing guests who had booked their treatments months in advance. Marcus smoothly handled the displaced guests, offering them massive future discounts and private apologies, ensuring my actual business reputation remained intact while giving Sylvia the illusion of total control. Sylvia and her friends demanded gold-infused facials, deep tissue massages, and mud wraps using imported volcanic clay. My spa technicians worked tirelessly maintaining perfect professional smiles while quietly logging thousands of dollars in treatments onto Bradley's running tab. By early afternoon, the group migrated to the main dining room of my farm-to-table restaurant. They commandeered the massive oak table at the center of the room, pushing aside the reserved signs. Sylvia snapped her fingers at the sommelier, demanding the reserve wine list. She did not ask for prices. She pointed blindly at the most exclusive bottles in the cellar, including 3 bottles of a vintage Bordeaux that retailed for thousands of dollars each. I watched the video feed closely as Marcus personally delivered the wine. He uncorked the bottles with practiced elegance, pouring the dark red liquid into crystal glasses. Sylvia leaned back in her chair, holding her glass up to the light, before taking a long, satisfied sip. She then placed the glass down and leaned forward, capturing the attention of every woman at the table. I have to admit it took some maneuvering, Sylvia said, her voice carrying easily across the dining room. But this was always the grand plan. You all know Cassidy never had the intellect for real high-stakes business, but she always had a knack for manual labor. So I forced her to come up here and build this place. I knew Bradley would eventually need a solid asset portfolio for his corporate ventures. She did the heavy lifting in the dirt, and now my son gets the crown jewel. One of the women laughed, tapping her manicured nails against her wine glass. It is brilliant, Sylvia. But how did you get her to comply for 3 whole years? Sylvia waved her hand dismissively, a cruel smile twisting her features. Cassidy was born to serve. She thrives on taking orders. Remember her 18th birthday? The women murmured in agreement, leaning in closer. I did not throw her a party, Sylvia bragged, taking another sip of the expensive wine. Instead, I made her bake the massive 5-tier chocolate cake for Bradley's college graduation party. It was the exact same weekend, but Bradley's milestones always took priority. She spent her entire 18th birthday covered in flour and frosting in the kitchen, crying over mixing bowls while we celebrated her brother. She knows her place in this family. She is the help. She has always been the help. Inside my cold maintenance cabin, my hands gripped the edge of the wooden table. The memory of that birthday burned in my chest. I had spent 16 hours baking and decorating that cake, desperately hoping that if it was perfect, my mother might finally look at me with pride. When I carried it into the dining room, she had criticized the piping and sent me back to the kitchen to wash the dishes. But the pain of that memory was quickly replaced by a sharp, tactical thrill. My restaurant was equipped with state-of-the-art audio and visual security systems to protect the high-net-worth guests who frequently held private corporate meetings in the dining room. Every single word of Sylvia's boastful confession was currently being recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. Marcus caught my eye through the camera feed and gave another subtle nod. He was already backing up the file to my secure external server. She was openly admitting to premeditated financial manipulation and emotional abuse, providing me with an airtight character profile for the upcoming legal slaughter. The afternoon wore on, and the tab on the shadow ledger skyrocketed past $50,000 in a single day. Let them drink, I thought, closing the restaurant feed. Let them rack up a bill they can never hope to pay. I shifted my attention to the contractor logs, verifying that Bradley's bulldozers were still parked illegally near the protected tree line. My phone suddenly vibrated on the table, vibrating so hard it rattled against the wood. The caller ID flashed my lawyer, Mitchell. I picked it up, expecting an update on the Environmental Protection Agency filing I had asked him to prepare. But Mitchell did not greet me with his usual calm, professional tone. He sounded out of breath and frantic. Cassidy listened to me very carefully. Mitchell said, the words rushing out in a panicked stream. I just got an alert from the county commercial registry. Bradley did not just bring in a cheap demolition crew. He took that fraudulent power of attorney and the outdated deed to a predatory commercial lender in the city. My blood ran completely cold. Mitchell, what did he do? He used the resort as collateral, Cassidy. Mitchell's voice was grim. The lender did not do a proper title search because Bradley promised them a massive percentage of the casino profits. They fast-tracked the approval. Bradley just took out a $5 million hard money commercial loan against the property, and the cash hit his account 10 minutes ago. I stared blankly at the wall of the maintenance cabin. A hard money loan meant astronomical interest rates and immediate brutal consequences for default. Bradley had not just stolen my resort on paper. He had just mortgaged my entire empire to ruthless creditors, and now $5 million of dangerous money was hanging directly over my head. The $5 million hard money loan changed everything. Bradley was not just acting out of pure greed, he was acting out of desperate survival. From my vantage point in the dark maintenance cabin, I watched the resort security cameras track his movements. He was practically vibrating with manic energy, throwing crisp $100 bills at the bartenders and ordering rounds of top-shelf whiskey for the shady contractors he had hired. He looked exactly like a man who had just outrun a bullet, but someone else was watching him closely. Kendra sat at a quiet corner table in the lounge, sipping sparkling water. Her sharp auditor eyes tracked every single movement her husband made. She watched him throw down a platinum credit card that she knew had been completely maxed out for months. She listened to him brag loudly to Sylvia's country club friends about his visionary casino development plan. The math in her head was simply not adding up. Bradley was spending money like water, but just 3 days ago he had screamed at her for buying premium organic formula for their toddler. Her professional instincts overrode her marital loyalty. She knew a financial cover-up when she saw one. When Bradley ordered his fourth double whiskey and started loudly recounting his high school glory days to a bored contractor, Kendra made her move. She stood up, smoothed her designer skirt, and slipped away from the loud, crowded bar. She walked swiftly through the grand lobby and took the private elevator up to the VIP residential suite Sylvia had commandeered. Kendra entered the lavish suite and locked the heavy oak door behind her. The room was littered with shopping bags and half-empty champagne flutes left behind by my mother. Kendra ignored the mess and went straight for the mahogany desk in the corner. Bradley had carelessly left his laptop sitting open on the leather blotter. The screen had gone to sleep. She tapped the spacebar. A password prompt appeared. Bradley was an arrogant man who believed he was entirely untouchable, so he rarely bothered with complex security protocols. Kendra typed in the name of his favorite luxury car brand, followed by his birth year. The screen unlocked instantly. Kendra did not waste time looking through his emails or personal messages. She was a senior auditor for a reason. She went straight for the root of the truth. She opened his hidden banking folders and downloaded his offshore financial statements. Her eyes darted rapidly across the digital ledgers, tracking the incoming and outgoing capital. What she found made her blood run entirely cold. The image of the wealthy, successful businessman shattered completely into a million pieces. Bradley was completely, entirely broke. He was actually worse than broke. He was drowning in toxic, unmanageable debt. Kendra clicked into the real estate portfolio folder. A glaring red digital notice covered the screen. Their luxury Manhattan penthouse, the home where their toddler currently slept under the care of a nanny, had been legally foreclosed on exactly 6 months ago. Bradley had been hiding the legal notices by routing all the mail to a private post office box. They were officially weeks away from a physical eviction. She dug deeper, pulling up his offshore transactional history. The numbers were horrifying and irrefutable. Bradley had not been losing money on bad business investments or market downturns. He had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into illegal offshore sports betting syndicates. He had completely drained their joint savings accounts, their emergency funds, and their child's college trust. He had leveraged everything they owned to chase impossible bets. And then she saw the newest line item. A $5 million cash injection from a predatory commercial lender secured by the fraudulent deed to the haven. Bradley had zero intention of building a casino. The bulldozers parked outside the forest were just a visual smokescreen to convince the lender he had a viable development plan. He was using my resort as a massive unbacked ATM to pay off dangerous offshore bookies before they broke his legs. The heavy suite door suddenly banged open, hitting the wall with a loud, violent crack. Kendra slammed the laptop shut and spun around. Bradley stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. His face was flushed from the expensive whiskey, and his silk tie was loosened. The charming, confident facade he had been wearing in the bar was gone, entirely replaced by a dark, paranoid rage. "What are you doing snooping on my computer, Kendra?" he demanded. His voice slurred but incredibly threatening. Kendra did not back down. She stood her ground, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I am doing my job, Bradley. I am looking at the actual numbers. You are completely bankrupt. You lost our home. You stole our child's college fund to pay for illegal sports bets. And now you have taken out a $5 million predatory loan against a property you stole from your sister." Bradley's eyes darkened. He kicked the door shut behind him and locked the deadbolt. The loud click of the heavy lock echoed in the tense room. He advanced on her, moving with a sudden, terrifying speed that completely ignored the alcohol in his system. He closed the distance between them, backing her up against the heavy mahogany desk. "You are going to keep your mouth shut," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You are going to smile and play the supportive wife while I fix this mess. I just secured $5 million today. We are back on top. You committed corporate fraud? Bradley Kendra fired back, refusing to show the intense fear rising in her chest. That loan is secured by a fraudulent deed. The moment the lender does a deep audit or Cassidy takes you to court, you are going to federal prison. I will not let you drag me and our child down with you. Bradley grabbed her roughly by the upper arms, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of expensive liquor and pure desperation. Listen to me very carefully, he whispered, his tone dripping with absolute malice. If you breathe a single word of this to anyone, I will destroy you. I have $5 million in liquid cash right now. I will hire the most vicious, ruthless divorce attorneys in Manhattan. I will drag your professional name through the mud. I will tell the courts you were fully complicit in the fraud. I will strip you of your auditing license, and I will use my new wealth to take full custody of our child. You will never see him again. Do you understand me? Kendra stared into the cold eyes of the man she had married, realizing he was a complete stranger. He was a cornered animal willing to sacrifice his own family to save himself. She needed to survive this room, but she also needed immediate ammunition. She slowly lowered her hands, letting them rest against the edge of the desk right next to her open clutch purse. Her fingers expertly brushed against the side of her smartphone resting inside. Without breaking eye contact with her unhinged husband, she subtly pressed the side button, activating the voice memo application she had queued up moments before he entered. Are you threatening to take my child away if I report your federal loan fraud? Bradley? She asked, her voice perfectly clear and steady, projecting directly toward the hidden microphone. I am promising to ruin your entire life if you cross me. He confirmed, his voice recorded in crystal clear digital audio. You are going to pack your bags right now. We are going downstairs to Smile for my mother and her rich friends. And you are going to act like the luckiest woman in the world. The early morning mist still clung to the manicured lawns of the Haven when the peaceful silence was violently torn apart. The deep, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines echoed off the Catskill Mountains, shaking the floorboards of my hidden maintenance cabin. I poured my black coffee into a thermos and stepped out into the crisp air. Bradley had not wasted a single second. Rolling up the main service road was a convoy of massive yellow bulldozers, excavators, and heavy dump trucks. They bypassed the main resort buildings and headed straight for the western ridge where the ancient oak forest stood. These trees had been growing for over 200 years, undisturbed and deeply rooted in the history of the land. I jogged down the narrow utility path, staying out of sight until I reached the edge of the forest. Marcus and my dedicated groundskeeping crew were already there. They had sprinted across the dew-covered grass and formed a human barricade in front of the lead bulldozer. Marcus stood tall with his arms crossed, refusing to budge as the massive steel tracks ground to a halt just inches from his boots. The contractor leaned out of the cab, shouting over the engine noise, demanding they move out of the way. Before I could step out of the shadows, the heavy wooden doors of the main lodge slammed open. Sylvia marched across the lawn, practically vibrating with indignation. She was flanked by two of her wealthy friends who treated the scene like a morning theatrical performance. Sylvia pointed a manicured finger directly at Marcus, screaming over the roar of the idling machinery. She demanded to know why the hired help was standing in the way of her son's visionary progress. Marcus tried to maintain his professional composure. He raised his voice, explaining that clearing this specific section of the forest violated multiple local ordinances and required specialized permits that the resort did not possess. He warned her that tearing down these oaks would result in immediate catastrophic fines from the Environmental Protection Agency. Sylvia did not care about permits or environmental regulations. She cared about absolute control. She laughed, a sharp, biting sound that cut through the cold air. You do not dictate policy to the owners, she yelled, her face flushed with tyrannical fury. You are nothing but a glorified gardener, Marcus. You are all fired. Every single one of you. Pack your lockers and get off my property before I call the local sheriff to arrest you for trespassing. Marcus looked stricken, his loyal crew exchanging panicked glances. This was their livelihood, but Sylvia was treating them like disposable trash. That was the moment I finally stepped out from the tree line and walked directly into the center of the conflict. I bypassed my mother completely and positioned myself squarely in the pathway of the lead bulldozer. The driver shifted nervously in his seat, killing the engine. A heavy, tense silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the sound of the wind through the remaining oak leaves. Bradley emerged from the cluster of heavy machinery, looking incredibly smug. He had a triumphant swagger in his step, clutching the rolled-up blueprints in one hand and the fraudulent notarized deed in the other. He marched right up to my face, smelling strongly of stale whiskey and expensive cologne. "You are out of your depth, Cassidy," he sneered, waving the useless deed right in my face like a victory flag. "This land is mine. These trees are mine. You spent 3 years building a pathetic little nature retreat, but I am building an empire. I am wiping your legacy completely off the map today. Move out of the way or I will tell the driver to pave the road right over you." Marcus took a step forward, ready to defend me, but I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. I looked at Bradley's bloodshot eyes and manic grin. He felt entirely invincible. He thought he was crushing me into the dirt, demonstrating his ultimate superiority in front of our mother. He had no idea he was standing on a landmine that was about to detonate and obliterate his entire life. I did not argue with him. I did not scream or beg or throw a tantrum like Sylvia would have done. I calmly reached into the pocket of my heavy work jacket and pulled out my phone. I raised the camera and methodically snapped high-resolution photos of the lead bulldozer. I captured the license plates, the contractor's company logo painted on the heavy metal door, and the exact position of the machinery on the property line. I then pointed the camera directly at Bradley, snapping a crystal-clear picture of him holding the fraudulent deed while actively commanding the demolition crew. "What are you doing?" Bradley demanded, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Documenting the moment, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I lowered my phone and took 2 deliberate steps to the left, clearing the pathway for the massive steel treads. "Go ahead, Bradley," I said, gesturing toward the towering ancient oaks. "Tear it all down. Be the big man." Bradley scoffed, masking his brief hesitation with loud bravado. He turned to the driver and screamed the order to commence demolition. The diesel engine roared back to life, spewing thick black smoke into the pristine morning air. The bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade digging into the earth and slamming violently into the trunk of the first-centuries-old oak. The sound of the destruction was sickening. The wood splintered and shrieked, cracking with a deafening groan that echoed across the valley. The majestic tree tilted slowly and then crashed heavily to the ground, shaking the earth beneath our feet. My mother clapped her hands in delight, while her friends murmured their approval. Marcus looked at me with pure horror, but I just offered him a tiny, reassuring nod. Right as the dust plumed up from the fallen tree, Bradley's phone chimed sharply in his pocket. He pulled it out, and I watched his face transform from arrogant pride to pure, unfiltered relief, masking deep greed. The notification illuminated his screen. The $5 million hard money commercial loan had just cleared the final banking hurdles and deposited directly into his checking account. He did not look at the fallen tree or the blueprints for his supposed casino. Right there in the dirt, standing over the destruction he had just caused, he quickly opened his banking application. His fingers flew across the screen in a desperate, frantic rhythm. He did not allocate a single cent to construction materials permits or architectural designs. Instead, he executed an immediate international wire transfer. He took $3 million of that highly leveraged, highly toxic loan and sent it straight to a shadow banking account in the Cayman Islands. He was paying off the violent offshore bookies who held his life in their hands, as Kendra had discovered the night before. He was using the destruction of my land to save his own skin, but he had just cemented the most severe federal crime of his life. The trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded. The $3 million international wire transfer vanished into the offshore ether, cementing Bradley's federal crimes and setting my trap in stone. He had used a fraudulent deed to secure a commercial loan and immediately diverted those funds across international borders to pay off illegal gambling syndicates. It was a textbook case of wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. For 2 weeks, I sat in the shadows of my maintenance cabin watching them hang themselves with their own arrogance. Sylvia and Bradley did not care about the sudden mysterious county injunction Mitchell had quietly filed to temporarily halt their illegal deforestation. They were too busy planning their coronation. To celebrate their perceived victory, Sylvia decided to throw the most extravagant gala the Haven had ever seen. She commandeered the resort's 5,000-square-foot grand ballroom, a space I had meticulously designed to highlight the natural beauty of the surrounding mountains. Sylvia completely ignored the rustic elegance of the room. She ordered thousands of rare white orchids flown in from Holland, draped the massive cedar support beams in tacky gold silk, and demanded crystal chandeliers be hauled out of storage. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the growing crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with beluga caviar, imported truffles, and vintage champagne. Every single exorbitant expense was charged directly to the resort's operational account, rapidly bleeding the remaining $2 million of Bradley's predatory loan dry. The room was packed with the county's elite. Local politicians, wealthy angel investors, and the entirety of Sylvia's exclusive country club registry filled the ballroom. Bradley strutted across the polished oak floor, wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo. He played the role of the visionary Wall Street prodigy to absolute perfection. He swirled a glass of reserve scotch, laughing loudly with a state senator and a prominent real estate developer. "It is all about leveraging dead equity," Bradley boasted to the men, his voice carrying easily over the string quartet playing in the corner. "My sister had no idea how to monetize this acreage. She was running a glorified charity for nature lovers. I am running a modern empire. The casino is just phase 1. He smiled brightly, completely ignoring the reality that his luxury Manhattan penthouse had been formally seized by the bank just days prior. Across the room, Sylvia glided through a circle of wealthy wives wearing a sequined gown that caught the light with every step. She stopped near a group of potential investors, purposefully raising her voice to ensure her narrative dominated the room. "Bradley has always possessed the true entrepreneurial spirit of our family," Sylvia bragged, waving her champagne flute. "I recognized his genius early on. I remember when he was 22 and needed $500,000 to launch his first investment firm. Cassidy was absolutely furious when I liquidated her college trust fund to provide his seed money. She actually threatened to move out. I told her she could pack her bags or start acting like a supportive sister. She stayed, of course. She cried over a state school education while Bradley was out building his network. She always folds when you push her hard enough." In the far corner of the ballroom, entirely removed from the flashing cameras and the clinking glasses, stood Kendra. She wore a dark, understated dress and clutched a thick manila folder tightly against her chest. Her face was chalky and pale, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and the exits. She looked physically sick. Kendra had not slept in days. The audio recording of Bradley, violently threatening to take her child away, played on a continuous, terrifying loop in her mind. But the fear had finally crystallized into a desperate, calculating anger. The heavy manila folder pressed against her chest contained the printed offshore banking ledgers, the foreclosure notices, the illegal gambling debts, and a USB drive holding the audio recording. She knew she was standing in a room full of powerful, wealthy people who were being actively conned by a desperate, bankrupt criminal. She was waiting for the perfect moment to slip out the side door and drive straight to the federal authorities. Suddenly, the string quartet stopped playing. Sylvia glided up the steps of the raised mahogany stage at the front of the ballroom. She stepped up to the microphone and tapped a silver spoon against her crystal flute. The sharp ringing sound commanded the immediate attention of the entire room. The low murmur of conversation faded into silence. Bradley stood proudly at the foot of the stairs, adjusting his expensive cuffs, rolling his shoulders back as he prepared to ascend his stolen throne. "Friends, dignitaries, and esteemed partners," Sylvia announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally wired. "Tonight marks a historic transition for this property. We are not just celebrating the rebirth of the Haven, we are celebrating the brilliant mind who will lead this resort into a billion-dollar future. It is my greatest honor to officially announce my son Bradley as the sole owner and chief executive officer of The massive solid oak double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thunderous crash. The entire room gasped and turned in unison. I stepped over the threshold, completely abandoning my usual practical work boots and flannel shirts. I wore a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that commanded every ounce of light in the room. My posture was absolute steel, my chin raised, my expression radiating cold, calculated authority. Right beside me walked Mitchell, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase, packed with irrefutable federal evidence. The triumphant, arrogant smile vanished from Bradley's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic as he stared at the sister he thought he had buried. The heavy oak doors had barely rebounded on their brass hinges before the entire ballroom descended into a suffocating silence. The string quartet halted mid-note. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased completely. Sylvia stood frozen on the raised mahogany stage. The vintage bubbles in her glass trembled and spilled onto her expensive sequined gown. She stared at me like I was a ghost crashing her meticulously planned resurrection. Bradley looked completely hollowed out. His bespoke velvet tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He shot a desperate, panicked glance toward the back corner of the room, where Kendra stood rigidly clutching her thick manila folder. He knew the walls were closing in rapidly, but his towering ego simply would not let him surrender in front of the county elite. Sylvia recovered her voice first, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. She leaned heavily into the microphone stand. Her voice echoed harshly over the expensive speakers. Security, she commanded, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest. Get this woman out of my ballroom immediately. She is trespassing on private property and ruining a private corporate function. 4 large security guards in dark tailored suits moved swiftly from the perimeter of the room. Sylvia smiled, a triumphant, smug smirk forming on her lips as they approached me. She looked toward her wealthy country club friends, expecting them to validate her absolute authority. But the guards did not grab my arms. They did not reach for Mitchell or attempt to block our path. Instead, they walked right past Sylvia's elite guests, bypassed the state senator, and formed a solid, unmoving wall directly behind me. Marcus stepped out from the shadows near the catering doors and gave the lead guard a single curt nod. The guards crossed their arms simultaneously, a synchronized display of absolute loyalty to their true employer. The collective gasp from the wealthy investors and local politicians was highly audible. The elite crowd began murmuring, exchanging bewildered and nervous looks. They were witnessing a hostile takeover in real time, and they suddenly realized Sylvia was not the one holding the reins. The illusion of her power was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her most important audience. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. My emerald green gown swept silently across the polished oak floor. The crowd parted for me and Mitchell like the Red Sea. I felt the heat of 100 stares, the heavy scent of imported white orchids, and the distinct sharp smell of my family's rising panic. My focus was entirely on the stage. I ascended the mahogany steps with measured, deliberate pacing. Sylvia tried to stand her ground, puffing out her chest to block my path to the podium. "You have absolutely no right to be here," she hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper meant only for my ears. "Bradley owns this entire resort. You are humiliating yourself in front of my investors, Cassidy. Leave before I call the local police and have you dragged out in handcuffs." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my presence. I simply reached out, bypassed her entirely, and gripped the base of the microphone stand. Sylvia tried to grab the metal stem to pull it away from me, but I was faster and much stronger. I firmly unplugged the heavy audio cable from the base of her microphone, killing her feed instantly. The loud popping sound of the disconnected audio made several investors in the front row flinch. Sylvia gasped, stepping back in shock as her main weapon was neutralized. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out a wireless headset microphone. It was a device seamlessly linked to the master soundboard Marcus was currently controlling in the back utility room. I slipped it over my ear and tapped the receiver twice. My voice boomed through the 5,000-square-foot ballroom, crystal clear and dripping with absolute unshakable authority. "Good evening, everyone," I said, offering a calm, professional smile to the sea of bewildered faces. I apologize for interrupting the festivities. I know my mother and my brother have spent the last few days selling you a very compelling narrative about the future of this property. They have promised you a sprawling high roller casino, a billion-dollar development, and a new era of visionary management. I turned to look directly at Bradley. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a cocktail napkin, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I walked toward the center of the stage, projecting my voice so every single local politician and angel investor hung on my every word. I am actually here to validate their claims, I announced. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sylvia looked completely baffled, her triumphant smirk returning hesitantly as she tried to calculate my angle. Mitchell stood silently to my left, his face a mask of legal detachment. I am here to publicly confirm that my mother is right. I continued, projecting my voice to the very back of the room. My father did indeed sign that notarized power of attorney years ago. The ancient deed Bradley holds is a legitimate binding legal document. The old wooden maintenance shack and the patch of dirt directly beneath it completely and legally belong to Bradley. Bradley let out a loud, barking laugh. He threw his arms up in the air, turning to the prominent real estate developer next to him with a look of overwhelming relief. "See," he shouted, pointing up at me. "I told you she was bluffing. She finally admits it. The whole property is mine." I did not smile. I did not blink. I signaled to Mitchell with a slight movement of my hand. My lead attorney stepped forward, setting his heavy leather briefcase down on the polished lid of the grand piano sitting on the edge of the stage. The brass latches snapped open with a loud, echoing click. Mitchell reached inside and retrieved a massive rolled-up county zoning map printed on heavy architectural stock. He handed the thick cylinder to me. I grabbed the edges of the heavy paper and unrolled it violently, slamming it flat against the closed lid of the grand piano. The sharp slap of the paper cut through Bradley's arrogant laughter like a physical strike. Bradley's smile vanished instantly. I tapped a tiny red-circled area on the massive blueprint, staring dead into his terrified eyes. "Yes, Bradley, you own the dirt under the maintenance cabin," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch that echoed through the entire ballroom. "But you forgot to read the coordinates." Mitchell smoothly reached into his heavy leather briefcase and extracted a second document, placing it directly beside the county zoning map on the gleaming lid of the grand piano. It was a heavily stamped certified topographical land survey. I dragged my index finger across the heavy paper, tracing a tiny, almost microscopic square, stranded right in the middle of a massive green expanse. "The deed you manipulated our father into signing was incredibly specific," I explained, my voice echoing clearly through the headset microphone, so every single investor in the room could hear the absolute finality of my words. It transferred the exact parcel described in the original 1920s property lines. Lot 4B. You and Sylvia were so blinded by greed, so desperate to steal my life's work, that neither of you bothered to hire a legitimate surveyor. Bradley stared at the map, his bloodshot eyes darting back and forth across the complex architectural lines. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Lot 4B is exactly 500 square feet. I continued, letting the sheer absurdity of his situation sink into the quiet ballroom. It is the exact footprint of the old rotting maintenance shack. That is your grand empire, Bradley. A literal patch of dirt. Sylvia shoved her way past the silent security guards, her sequined gown catching on the edge of a chair and tearing slightly. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her perfectly maintained aristocratic facade crumbling into desperate, frantic panic. "We hold the master deed. The entire property belongs to the family trust. We own the resort, the road, the forest, everything." Mitchell adjusted his glasses and offered my mother a smile completely devoid of warmth. "Actually, Sylvia, you own absolutely nothing," he stated, his crisp professional tone cutting through her hysteria. 3 years ago, when the county quietly placed the surrounding 50 acres up for public auction due to decades of unpaid property taxes by the original developer, my client purchased it in full. I took a deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at my mother's horrified face. "I bought the private access road. I bought the mineral spring. I bought the entire Western Ridge where every single resort building now stands. I bought the ancient oak forest you tried to bulldoze this morning. But I did not buy it under my name. I purchased the entire 50 acres through a blind holding company registered in Delaware. Mitchell pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from his briefcase and tossed them onto the piano. Articles of organization, he announced to the room, proving Cassidy is the sole managing member and absolute owner of the surrounding 50 acres. A low, collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy investors, local politicians, and country club socialites began whispering furiously among themselves. The prominent real estate developer who had been laughing with Bradley just moments before physically stepped back in disgust. They were not looking at Bradley like a Wall Street prodigy anymore. They were looking at him like a pathetic, incompetent fraud. "You are completely landlocked, Bradley," I said, driving the final nail into his coffin. "Your precious 500 square feet sits dead in the center of my multi-million-dollar private estate. You do not possess an easement. You have absolutely no legal access to a public road. You cannot lay a single water pipe. You cannot run a single electrical wire. You cannot even step 1 foot off your little patch of dirt without legally trespassing on my land." Bradley's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. The smug arrogance that had defined his entire existence vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked down at the rolled-up blueprints he still clutched in his hand, the plans for his imaginary luxury casino, and let them drop to the floor. They unspooled across the oak floorboards, meaningless and worthless. In the back of the room, I caught Kendra's eye. She stood perfectly still, her hands gripping her thick manila folder, a look of profound, chilling vindication washing over her pale face. She knew exactly what this meant. Bradley had used a worthless 500-square-foot dirt patch to collateralize a massive commercial loan. "You set me up," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of fear and rising rage. "I did not set you up," I replied calmly, my voice steady and cold over the speakers. "I simply let you dig your own grave and handed you the shovel." Suddenly, the reality of the international wire transfer he had executed that very morning crashed into his mind. He had sent $3 million of newly borrowed money to an offshore gambling syndicate, money secured by an asset he did not actually own. He had lied on federal banking documents. He had committed textbook wire fraud and grand larceny in a single keystroke. If the bank audited that loan, he was facing decades in federal prison. "You set me up!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking as pure, unfiltered panic completely overtook his senses. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body toward the stage, his hands reaching out violently to grab me. "What about the $5 million loan I just took out against the resort?" Bradley's hands clawed empty air just inches from my throat. Before his manicured fingers could even graze the silk of my gown, Marcus and the lead security guard intercepted his violent lunge. They moved with absolute precision, seizing Bradley by the shoulders and driving him hard into the polished mahogany floorboards. The sickening crack of his knees hitting the solid wood echoed loudly through the microphone still looped over my ear. He writhed and thrashed against their iron grip, his bespoke velvet tuxedo tearing at the seams, but he was completely pinned. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at my older brother, watching his polished Wall Street facade dissolve into the panicked, sweating mess of a cornered animal. "You took out a $5 million commercial loan against 50 acres of premium real estate that you do not own," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the cavernous ballroom. I smiled coldly, looking down at his bloodshot eyes. "You marched into a federally insured bank, sat across from a loan officer, and pledged my private property as collateral using a legally worthless piece of paper." Bradley stopped thrashing. His breath hitched in his chest as the monumental scale of his catastrophic error finally began to pierce through his blinding arrogance. "That alone would bankrupt you." I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp clinical pitch. "But the real tragedy for you, Bradley, is not just the fraudulent loan. It is what you decided to do with that money exactly 60 seconds after the funds cleared your checking account this morning." From the back corner of the silent ballroom, Kendra finally stepped out of the shadows. She walked purposefully down the center aisle, passing the horrified politicians and whispering investors. She did not look like a terrified, battered wife anymore. She walked with the fierce, unyielding posture of a woman who had just reclaimed her life. She ascended the wooden stairs of the stage and stopped right beside me. She opened the heavy manila folder she had been clutching all night. She pulled out a thick stack of printed banking ledgers and dropped them directly in front of Bradley's face. I gave them the routing numbers, Bradley Kendra said, her voice completely devoid of the fear that had chained her to him for years. I gave Cassidy the account logs. I gave her the offshore ledger. I gave her the audio recordings of you threatening to take my son away. You are done. Bradley stared at the printed ledgers resting on the mahogany floor. His face transformed from chalky white to an ashen, sickly gray. You wired $3 million of freshly borrowed, fraudulently obtained bank funds directly to an offshore shadow account in the Cayman Islands, I announced to the silent captive audience. You used a loan secured by my land to pay off your violent, illegal gambling debts. I stepped back and gestured to Mitchell. My lead attorney stepped up to the edge of the stage, adjusting his glasses and pulling a neatly typed legal brief from his leather case. When he spoke, his voice possessed the booming, terrifying cadence of a federal prosecutor delivering a closing argument. 18 U.S. Code, Section 1344. Mitchell recited his words, ringing out like hammer strikes. Bank fraud. Whoever knowingly executes a scheme or artifice to defraud a financial institution faces severe federal penalties. By presenting a deed for 500 square feet and intentionally misrepresenting it as a 50-acre commercial parcel to secure a $5 million loan, you have triggered this statute. Mitchell turned the page, his expression entirely ruthless. 18 U.S. Code Section 1343. Mitchell continued. Wire fraud. By utilizing interstate and international electronic communications to transfer $3 million of those fraudulently obtained funds to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate, you have triggered a secondary, equally devastating federal statute. Mitchell lowered the paper and looked directly down at Bradley, who was now trembling violently against the floorboards. You are not looking at a civil dispute over property lines, Bradley Mitchell stated coldly. You are looking at a maximum penalty of 30 years in a federal penitentiary and up to $1 million in fines for the bank fraud alone. Add the wire fraud, the international money laundering, and the grand larceny, and you will spend the rest of your natural breathing life sitting in a concrete federal cell. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The elite crowd of wealthy investors, local politicians, and country club socialites began to physically back away from the stage. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near a man who had just been publicly unmasked as a massive federal criminal. Sylvia stood frozen near the grand piano, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and frantic self-preservation. For my entire life, she had shielded Bradley. She had funded his failures, excused his cruelty, and celebrated his empty bravado. But Sylvia was a creature of status, and survival was her only true instinct. As she looked at her golden child pinned to the floor facing decades in federal prison, her maternal loyalty evaporated in a fraction of a second. I had absolutely nothing to do with this, Sylvia screamed, her voice cracking with high-pitched hysteria. She backed away from Bradley, holding her hands up defensively toward the crowd of her wealthy peers. I did not sign any loan documents. This was his project. I am completely innocent. I had no idea he was doing this. Bradley whipped his head around, staring at our mother in pure, shattered disbelief. The woman who had enabled his worst impulses his entire life was instantly throwing him to the wolves to save her own country club reputation. He opened his mouth to scream at her, to drag her down into the mud with him, but the words died in his throat. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows of the grand ballroom, the darkness of the mountain night was suddenly violently fractured. Flashes of intense rhythmic light swept across the glass. Red and blue strobes painted the white orchids, the gold silk, and the crystal chandeliers in stark, alternating colors. The distant wailing scream of heavy sirens echoed through the valley, growing louder and more deafening by the second. The heavy crunch of gravel and the screech of tires signaled the arrival of multiple vehicles tearing up the main service road. Bradley went entirely limp against the mahogany floorboards, the last remaining ounces of fight completely draining from his body, as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the terrified tears streaming down his face. The heavy oak doors swung open again, this time violently pushed inward by 4 armed federal agents, flanked by local county sheriffs. The flashing strobes from the driveway cast long chaotic shadows across the tacky gold silk and imported white orchids. Bradley did not even try to run. He stayed pinned to the floor, his body shaking with deep, pathetic sobs as the lead agent hoisted him up by the collar of his ruined velvet tuxedo. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. The agent's voice was loud and completely devoid of sympathy as he recited Bradley's Miranda rights, formally charging him with federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and international money laundering. The elite guests, the very people Sylvia had spent weeks courting and impressing, recoiled in absolute disgust. The prominent real estate developer immediately pulled out his phone and deleted Bradley's contact information right in front of him. Wealthy wives raised their hands to their mouths, whispering furiously, their eyes darting between the disgraced prodigy and his horrified mother. The room treated them like a sudden, highly infectious disease. Sylvia's pristine socialite mask completely shattered. She lunged forward, her expensive sequined gown tearing further as she grabbed the arm of the arresting federal agent. She shrieked hysterically, demanding they unhand her son, screaming that there had been a terrible mistake and that they were arresting the wrong person. The agent warned her once to step back. When she refused, clawing frantically at Bradley's restrained wrists, a local sheriff physically grabbed her shoulders and threatened her with an immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. Sylvia collapsed onto the polished oak floor, weeping uncontrollably, her perfect hair falling in a tangled mess around her face. In less than 5 minutes, her decades of carefully cultivated country club prestige burned to absolute ashes. She was no longer the matriarch of a real estate empire. She was the hysterical mother of a common federal criminal. The sun rose over the Catskill Mountains the next morning, burning away the lingering fog. I sat on the porch of the main lodge, enjoying a cup of black coffee while reviewing the resort's operational transition plan with Marcus. The property was finally entirely mine. The toxic cloud my family had brought to the mountain was lifting, but a cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and Sylvia had absolutely nothing left to lose. Just before noon, Mitchell's dark sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. He stepped out, his expression grim and rigidly professional. He did not bring good news. He placed a fresh stack of thick legal documents on the patio table. Sylvia had gone completely manic. Desperate to save her golden child from spending his pre-trial weeks in a federal holding cell, she had executed a total financial liquidation overnight. She sold her exclusive country club shares at a massive, embarrassing loss. She liquidated her entire retirement portfolio. She emptied her 401k and mortgaged her remaining personal assets just to scrape together the astronomical cash required to post Bradley's federal bail. Bradley was currently out of police custody wearing a GPS ankle monitor and strictly confined to the state, having permanently surrendered his passport. But they were not retreating in shame. They were doubling down. Mitchell tapped the thickest document in the stack. It was a formal court summons. Sylvia and Bradley, completely blinded by their own humiliation and rage, had filed a massive civil lawsuit against me. The charges were so fiercely delusional, they bordered on fiction. They were publicly claiming that I had committed severe elder abuse. The lawsuit alleged that I had maliciously manipulated our late father Thomas on his deathbed. Sylvia's high-priced, aggressively unethical litigation team claimed I had coerced a dying man into hiding the family's capital, forcing him to let the property taxes on the surrounding 50 acres lapse intentionally. The filing stated I then used his hidden stolen funds to purchase the land at auction through my blind LLC, effectively stealing the resort's future from Bradley. It was a blatant, fabricated lie. My father had died penniless, stripped bare by Bradley's previous financial failures and Sylvia's relentless spending. I had built my LLC with my own sweat, blood, and design commissions. I saved every single penny I earned while they blew their cash on luxury cars and expensive dinners. Mitchell explained their strategy clearly. They knew they could not win on the facts. The paper trail proving my independent wealth was ironclad. They were filing a frivolous explosive lawsuit simply to freeze my assets, tie the property up in endless litigation, and stall Bradley's criminal trial by muddying the legal waters. They wanted to drain my bank accounts with legal fees and drag me down into the dirt with them. I picked up the heavy legal summons, feeling the weight of their desperate, malicious retaliation in my hands. They were trying to destroy my reputation before I could even reopen the resort doors. Right as I turned the first page to read the fabricated accusations, my phone vibrated sharply against the glass tabletop. The screen illuminated with a direct text message from Sylvia. I stared at the glowing words, my jaw clenching as her absolute delusion stared back at me. "I will drag your name through the mud. You will lose everything." I stared at the glowing words on my phone screen, my jaw clenching as her absolute delusion stared back at me. "I will drag your name through the mud. You will lose everything." I locked the screen and slid the phone into my pocket. She was about to find out that the mud was my territory, and I had been building a foundation in it for years. 2 weeks later, the air in the downtown legal mediation center was so thick with hostility, it felt difficult to draw a breath. We were seated around a massive polished mahogany conference table in a glass-walled room on the 40th floor. The city skyline stretched out behind us, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension inside. Bradley sat across from me. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, but the bulky outline of the GPS ankle monitor beneath his trouser leg ruined the billionaire aesthetic he was so desperately trying to project. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at his cuticles while his knee bounced in a frantic, nervous rhythm. Sylvia sat rigidly beside him, draped in conservative black cashmere, playing the part of the grieving, wronged matriarch to absolute perfection. But the real noise was coming from their newly retained legal counsel. Bradley had clearly scraped the bottom of the barrel with Sylvia's liquidated retirement funds. His lawyer, a loud, red-faced man named Vance, possessed the aggressive, sleazy energy of a late-night television attorney. He was currently pacing the length of the mahogany table, his voice booming as he addressed the retired federal judge, serving as our mediator. "My clients have been the victims of a highly sophisticated predatory financial ambush," Vance declared, slamming his open palm flat against the polished wood to emphasize his point. The smack echoed sharply off the glass walls. Cassidy Wilson engaged in a deliberate, malicious shell game. She used a hidden LLC to acquire the land surrounding my client's resort, and she did it using funds illegally siphoned from her dying father's estate. "We are filing an immediate injunction to freeze every single one of her bank accounts, seize the holding company, and halt any construction on the property until this matter is resolved in court." Vance leaned over this table, bringing his red face uncomfortably close to mine. He smiled, displaying a row of unnaturally white veneers. "You are not going to spend another dime of that stolen money, little lady. We are going to lock you up in litigation for the next decade." I did not blink. I simply stared at a small scuff mark on his expensive silk tie. Mitchell, sitting calmly to my right, did not even bother to look up from his legal pad. He just continued writing in smooth, even strokes. Seeing that his intimidation tactics were failing to elicit any reaction, Vance sighed dramatically and returned to his seat, gesturing for Sylvia to take the floor. My mother reached into her designer handbag and produced a pristine white linen handkerchief. What followed was a display of calculated manipulation so masterful it belonged on a cinema screen. Sylvia's shoulders slumped. Her carefully maintained posture collapsed into the tragic silhouette of a broken, grieving widow. When she spoke, her voice trembled with perfectly calibrated, manufactured heartbreak. "I just do not understand how she could do this to her own flesh and blood," Sylvia whispered, dabbing the dry corner of her eye with the linen square. "Thomas and I built this family. We worked our entire lives to secure a legacy for our children. When my husband got sick, when the cancer finally took hold of him, we were all so devastated. We were vulnerable." She paused, letting out a jagged, breathy sob. The mediator, an older man with kind eyes, leaned forward sympathetically. Sylvia seized the opening, amplifying her performance. Cassidy swooped in during his final week. Sylvia continued, her voice gaining a desperate, pleading edge. She isolated my husband from me. She isolated him from Bradley. Thomas was heavily medicated, confused and terrified. Cassidy manipulated a dying man. She convinced him to drain the family trust and hide the cash, starving our business, so the county would seize the outer land. Then she used his stolen money to buy it back in secret. She tortured her own father on his deathbed just to steal her brother's inheritance. It is sick. It is evil. Sylvia covered her face with both hands, letting her shoulders heave as she openly wept. Bradley reached over and patted her arm, playing the role of the dutiful, protective son. The entire spectacle was nauseating. It was a complete fabricated inversion of reality. In my father's final days, Sylvia had been entirely absent, too busy securing her status at the country club to sit by a dying man's bedside. Bradley had been overseas, spending the last of the company's liquid cash on luxury cars. I had been the only one there, holding his hand, listening to his regrets, and promising him I would fix the rot they had brought into our family. The mediator looked over at me, his expression hardening slightly. These are incredibly severe allegations, Miss Wilson. Elder abuse, financial coercion of a terminal patient, and fraudulent acquisition of assets. Do you have any response to your mother's testimony? I let the silence stretch out. I let Sylvia's fake sobs echo against the glass. I let Bradley's smug, arrogant smirk slowly return to his face. I allowed them to completely exhaust their ammunition, letting them believe they had successfully painted me into a corner. I turned to Mitchell and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Mitchell closed his legal pad. He reached down and popped the brass latches of his heavy leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic clicks sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. He reached his hand inside and pulled out a small rectangular object. Without saying a single word, Mitchell placed a black digital audio recorder dead center on the polished mahogany table. Mitchell pressed the small silver button on the side of the device. A brief hiss of static crackled through the mediation room, cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. Then came a sharp cough, followed by a deep, gravelly voice that made the blood drain entirely from Sylvia's face. "This is Thomas Wilson." The voice was unmistakable. It was my father. He sounded tired, his breath catching slightly, but the absolute clarity and commanding authority in his tone were exactly as I remembered. Today is October 14th. I am sitting in the office of my estate attorney, Mitchell Vance. I am of sound mind, and I am recording this statement as a formal addendum to my last will and testament. Bradley practically fell backward in his leather chair. His mouth hung open in silent, stupid shock. My father's recorded voice continued echoing off the glass walls. My wife Sylvia and my son Bradley believe I am blind to what they are doing. They think the medication has made me stupid. But I see the ledgers. I see the offshore transfers. I have watched them treat this family legacy like a bottomless ATM for the last 5 years. Sylvia's country club debts, Bradley's sports cars, the failed vanity projects. They are bankrupting the resort, and they are doing it right in front of me. Vance, the aggressive, table-pounding lawyer, stopped pacing entirely. He stared at the recorder, his red face suddenly turning a very distinct shade of pale gray. He looked down at his clients, realizing immediately that the entire foundation of his elder abuse lawsuit was completely evaporating. "I know they plan to take everything when I'm gone," my father's voice rasped, pausing to take a heavy, labored breath. "Sylvia has spent the last year cornering me into signing the joint trusts, securing the buildings and the physical resort into her name. She thinks she has won. But my wife was always blinded by shiny things, and she never bothered to read the geological surveys. I did not look at the recorder. I kept my eyes locked on Sylvia. Her fake tears had vanished completely. Her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her manicured knuckles were stark white. Lot 4B. My father stated, his voice growing stronger, laced with a bitter sort of triumph. "The patch of dirt right under the old maintenance shack. Sylvia begged me to sell it to the county years ago, calling it an eyesore. I refused. And because it was just a rusted shack on 500 square feet of dirt, She did not fight me when I kept it completely out of her joint trust. She thought it was worthless. Bradley was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. But it is not worthless, my father continued, the metallic audio filling the stunned silence of the room. That dirt sits directly on top of the largest unmapped underground aquifer in the entire county. The water rights tied exclusively to that specific parcel control the supply for the entire western ridge. Whoever owns Lot 4B controls the lifeblood of the valley. Without it, the resort cannot operate a single sink, let alone a luxury hotel or a massive casino. The retired federal judge acting as our mediator let out a low, audible breath. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He recognized a flawless legal checkmate when he saw one. I am leaving Lot 4B to my daughter Cassidy, my father's voice declared, ringing with an undeniable fierce pride. I am leaving it to her free and clear, completely outside the reach of the family trust. A heavy silence followed on the recording. I felt a tight knot form in my throat. I had listened to this tape dozens of times over the last 4 years, but hearing it now in front of the people who had tried to destroy me, the emotion felt incredibly raw and potent. Cassidy, my father said, speaking directly to the microphone, his voice thick with emotion and absolute certainty. You are the only one with my spine. Build your empire on this water and never let your mother or brother know until it is too late. The recording ended with a sharp click. Mitchell calmly reached out and turned the device off. He slid it back into his leather briefcase, the snap of the brass latches echoing like a gavel striking a sound block. Vance looked absolutely disgusted. He violently shoved his legal pad into his own briefcase, realizing he had just staked his professional reputation on a massive fabricated lie fed to him by 2 desperate criminals. He was not just losing this mediation. He was facing potential sanctions for bringing a demonstrably fraudulent and malicious lawsuit to the table. He glared at Bradley and Sylvia with pure venom. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to my mother. Sylvia stared at the exact spot on the table where the recorder had been. Her jaw trembled violently. The realization that her own husband had seen right through her lifelong manipulation, that he had viewed her as a parasite and actively plotted against her from his deathbed, completely shattered her fragile reality. Her life's work as the grand matriarch was a total lie. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her eyes rolled back. Her knees gave way beneath the heavy mahogany table, and she collapsed completely into her chair, her head slumping forward as her world finally burned to the ground. The heavy silence in the room lasted exactly 5 seconds before Bradley's survival instinct kicked in. With his mother completely catatonic beside him and his sleazy lawyer packing his briefcase to flee, Bradley slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table. "It is a fake!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the black audio recorder. "She paid someone to make that. It is an AI voice clone. You can generate anyone's voice online now for $20. My father never said any of that. She is trying to steal my inheritance with a deep fake." The retired federal judge stared at Bradley with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disdain. Mitchell did not even bother to defend the recording. He simply picked up a notarized sealed chain of custody document provided by the estate law firm and slid it across the table toward the mediator. The ink and the stamps from 4 years ago spoke entirely for themselves. Bradley was hyperventilating, pulling at the collar of his shirt as if it were choking him. He looked wildly around the room, desperate for an ally. He found none. Instead, the sharp, deliberate click of high heels echoed from the back of the room. Kendra had been sitting in the shadows against the far glass wall for the entire mediation. She had arrived separately from Bradley and Sylvia, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense clasp. Up until this very second, she had not made a single sound or movement. Bradley turned in his chair, his eyes lighting up with a pathetic glimmer of hope. "Kendra, tell them. Tell them this is a scam. You know my father would never do this to me." Kendra did not answer him. She walked with terrifying measured precision across the polished floor, stopping directly behind Bradley's chair. She unclasped her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents. Without a word, she dropped the heavy stack directly onto the table in front of him. The thud made Bradley flinch. He looked down at the bold, capitalized text on the cover page. The remaining color drained from his face. "Sign them," Kendra said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth or affection. "I am taking the house, I am taking full custody of our son, and I am severing all legal ties to you as of this morning." "Kendra, what are you doing?" Bradley choked out, reaching for her hand. "You cannot do this right now. We are under attack." Kendra snatched her hand back as if he were highly radioactive. She stepped away from him and walked to the head of the table, standing directly in front of the mediator. She reached into her blazer pocket and produced a sleek silver encrypted flash drive. She placed it gently onto the mahogany wood right next to Mitchell's audio recorder. Judge Kendra said, speaking with the crisp, authoritative tone of a seasoned professional. "My husband has always treated me like a decorative accessory. He completely forgot that before I married him, I spent 6 years working as a senior forensic auditor for one of the largest accounting firms in Manhattan." Bradley's jaw dropped. He tried to stand up, but the weight of his ankle monitor and his own shock kept him pinned to the leather chair. "When the federal agents raided our home 2 weeks ago, I did not just sit around crying, like my mother-in-law Kendra continued, gesturing vaguely toward Sylvia's slumped, defeated figure. I opened Bradley's personal servers. I cracked his private drives. I spent the last 14 days tracing every single dime he moved over the last 5 years." Kendra tapped the silver flash drive with her index finger. "Everything the federal prosecutors need is on this drive," she announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "Here is the undeniable proof. I have logged and categorized it all." The wire fraud. Clear evidence of Bradley routing corporate construction loans into private holding companies. The identity theft. He forged his dying father's signature to secure 3 massive lines of credit just weeks before Thomas passed away. Janchu. The offshore gambling ledgers. He funneled over $4 million into illegal overseas sports betting syndicates, masking the transfers as vendor payouts. Vance, the aggressive attorney who had been threatening me just 10 minutes prior, let out a low groan. He zipped his briefcase shut, stood up, and physically walked away from the table, putting as much distance between himself and Bradley as the room would allow. "You set me up!" Bradley shrieked, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched whine. "You are my wife. You cannot testify against me. Spousal privilege. Spousal privilege does not cover ongoing criminal enterprises that drag my name and my child's future into federal court." Kendra snapped back, shutting him down instantly. "You ruined yourself, Bradley. I am just providing the receipts." Sylvia finally lifted her head. Her immaculate makeup was ruined, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She looked at her daughter-in-law with wide, pleading eyes, extending a trembling, jewel-laden hand across the table. "Kendra, please," Sylvia begged, her voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. "Do not do this. We are family. We can fix this. Do not destroy us." Kendra looked down at the woman who had spent years treating her like an incubator and a social prop. Her expression hardened into pure, unadulterated disgust. "I will not let my son carry the toxic legacy of this family," Kendra stated coldly. She turned her back on Sylvia and Bradley, walking around the large table until she stood directly in front of me. We had never been close. For years we had barely spoken at family events. But as I looked up at her now, I saw a woman who had finally cut the puppet strings and taken absolute control of her own life. Kendra extended her hand. I stood up and shook it firmly. The grip was strong, an unspoken pact between the only 2 people in the room who had actually seen the rot and decided to burn it out. "Good luck with the resort," Cassidy, Kendra said. She turned on her heel, her posture perfect, and walked out of the mediation room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, sealing Bradley and Sylvia inside the inescapable cage of their own destruction. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind Kendra, sealing Bradley and Sylvia inside the inescapable cage of their own destruction. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of complete ruin. The retired federal judge serving as our mediator stared at the silver flash drive, then shifted his gaze to the black audio recorder. He did not need to deliberate. He did not need to hear another word from Vance, who was already inching his way toward the exit door. The judge looked at Bradley with a cold, unyielding stare and formally declared the mediation over. He stated with absolute authority that the lawsuit against me was dismissed with extreme prejudice. He added that he was legally obligated to turn the flash drive and the audio recording directly over to the United States Attorney's Office before the end of the business day. Bradley sank lower into his leather chair. His expensive charcoal suit suddenly looked entirely too big for his deflating frame. He stared blankly at the mahogany wood, his mind clearly failing to process the sheer velocity of his downfall. Sylvia remained utterly unresponsive beside him, her eyes fixed on a meaningless spot on the floor. They were beaten. They had nothing left, but I was not finished. I reached into Mitchell's open briefcase. My fingers bypassed the neatly organized legal pads and pulled out a single thick manila envelope. I placed it on the table and slid it across the smooth, polished surface. It glided silently, stopping right under Bradley's nose. He flinched as if the paper had physically burned him. He did not reach for it. He just stared at the envelope, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "Open it, Bradley," I said, my voice calm, level, and carrying the weight of an executioner. He swallowed hard. With trembling hands, he peeled back the metal clasp and pulled out the thick stack of papers. The header on the first page featured the bold, unmistakable seal of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, followed immediately by a heavy itemized invoice stamped by the Department of the Interior. I watched his bloodshot eyes scan the first few lines. I watched his confusion slowly morph into a fresh, unprecedented terror as his gaze locked onto the final number at the bottom of the page. "Do you remember your second day on the property?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands perfectly in my lap. "You wanted to make a statement. You wanted to show everyone in the county that the new king had arrived. So you bypassed the local planning commission, ignored the land surveyors, and ordered a crew of heavy excavators to clear out the ancient woods on the eastern perimeter. You told the contractors it was just dead brush standing in the way of your new valet parking pavilion." Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at the federal paper, then back up at me, his eyes wide and completely panicked. "What you failed to realize because you were too arrogant to actually read the property deeds is that those woods were not dead brush." I continued, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "That specific tract of land was registered as a strict federal conservation easement. It was a protected ecological habitat for 3 different endangered species, and my father placed it under a permanent federal trust over a decade ago." Bradley dropped the papers. They scattered across the mahogany table. "When you brought in those bulldozers and ripped up that soil, you did not just commit a minor zoning violation," I said, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single syllable. "You committed a severe federal environmental crime. You destroyed protected wetlands and violated a federal trust." Sylvia finally blinked, the words penetrating her catatonic state. She slowly turned her head to look at her golden child, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on her. "The EPA does not play around with conservation easements," Mitchell added, speaking for the first time since he had played the tape. "Their ecological damage assessment was completed last week. The fines for the habitat destruction combined with the mandatory environmental restoration costs are staggering." I tapped the heavy invoice resting in front of Bradley. $2.8 million, I stated clearly, letting the massive number hang in the stale air of the room. "That is the total penalty, payable immediately to the federal government." Bradley shook his head frantically, his breathing turning into sharp, desperate wheezes. "The resort owns that land," he practically shrieked, his voice cracking under the strain. "The holding company is liable. You cannot put this on me. We will just declare the hospitality group bankrupt." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that made him press his back hard against his leather chair. "You bypassed the holding company, Bradley," I reminded him. You were so eager to get those trees knocked down and assert your dominance that you did not wait for the corporate accounts to clear. You signed the contractor work orders yourself. You authorized the heavy machinery under your own personal name. The federal government does not care about your corporate shell companies when they have a direct personal signature ordering the destruction of a protected environmental trust. He looked down at the second page of the scattered documents. Right there, at the very bottom of the contractor work order, was his unmistakable sweeping signature in blue ink. He had personally and legally tied himself to the environmental disaster. You are personally liable for the $2.8 million, I told him. And since your wife just handed a federal judge the audited ledgers proving you embezzled your remaining construction funds to pay off illegal offshore gambling debts, you do not have a single penny left to pay it. Sylvia let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his ruined suit, shaking him with a sudden, violent burst of manic energy. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls, her perfectly crafted socialite mask entirely gone. "What did you do to us?" Bradley did not answer her. He just stared at his signature on the work order, his eyes vacant and completely glazed over. The reality of his absolute financial annihilation had finally set in. He was going to federal prison for wire fraud, and he was taking a multi-million-dollar federal penalty with him. He had lost the resort. He had lost his wife. He had lost his son. He had lost everything. I stood up from the table, taking a moment to smooth the front of my blazer. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, worthless, and inadequate. They were currently weeping over a stack of federal fines, completely destroyed by their own toxic greed and staggering arrogance. "Let us go, Mitchell," I said, turning away from the table. "We have a resort to open." I turned my back on the table, my hand reaching for the heavy stainless steel handle of the glass door. Mitchell was right beside me, his leather briefcase securely fastened, completely indifferent to the chaos we were leaving behind. "Wait." The word was a ragged, breathless shriek. It did not come from Bradley. It came from Sylvia. The terrifying reality of her financial exposure had finally managed to penetrate her shock. She had co-signed the massive $5 million construction loan to fund Bradley's delusional expansion plans. The bank had issued that loan strictly against the projected future value of the resort. With the EPA dropping a $2.8 million lien on the property, and my father's audio tape proving the land lacked the vital water rights required to operate the resort, was instantly rendered worthless collateral. Sylvia's mind connected the dots with brutal efficiency. The bank would immediately trigger the default clauses. They would seize everything she owned to recover the $5 million. Her pristine country club estate, her luxury vehicles, her offshore accounts, even the diamonds resting against her collarbone. She was entirely destitute. I did not stop walking. My hand grasped the door handle. Sylvia scrambled out of her chair so fast it tipped backward, crashing onto the polished floor. She lunged across the room, her black cashmere wrap sliding off her shoulders and pooling on the ground. She threw her body forward, dropping heavily onto her knees right at my feet. Her manicured hands, adorned with expensive rings, bought with my father's stolen money, clamped desperately onto the fabric of my tailored skirt. "Please, Cassidy, we're family. You have so much money. If you don't drop the environmental lawsuit, we'll be on the streets." I froze. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing infection. She was kneeling on the cold floor, her perfect hair disheveled, her face twisted in an ugly mask of absolute terror. She was crying real tears now, harsh and desperate, pulling at my clothes like a cornered animal begging for its life. Bradley remained in his seat, too paralyzed by the prospect of federal prison to even attempt to help his mother. He just stared at the wall, a broken, empty shell of a man. I stared at Sylvia's hands clutching my skirt. The sight triggered a vivid, suffocating memory from when I was 16. I remembered the harsh, burning smell of industrial bleach. I remembered my hands cracking and peeling from cheap rubber gloves. Sylvia had marched into my bedroom one summer morning and informed me that my mere existence was a financial burden. While Bradley was handed the keys to a brand new sports car for barely graduating high school, Sylvia had forced me to take a job on the custodial staff at her elite country club. I spent my entire summer scrubbing toilets and wiping down locker room showers just to pay for my own basic school supplies, forced to hide whenever Sylvia and her wealthy friends walked past. She had wanted to break my spirit. She had wanted to ensure I knew exactly where I stood in her hierarchy. The memory did not bring me pain. It brought me absolute icy clarity. I looked down into Sylvia's frantic, pleading eyes. I felt no pity. I felt no obligation. I felt absolutely nothing for her. In America, debts are paid, I said, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register that echoed off the glass walls. You can sell your diamonds or you can go scrub toilets just like you made me do when I was a teenager. Your 48 hours are up. I grabbed her wrists, peeling her fingers off my skirt with a sharp, forceful motion. I dropped her hands back into her lap. Sylvia let out a loud, pathetic wail, collapsing forward until her forehead rested against the cold floor. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing that her ultimate weapon, family guilt, possessed zero power over me. I pushed the glass door open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the mediation center. Mitchell followed closely behind, allowing the heavy door to swing shut, sealing the sound of Sylvia's weeping inside the room. We walked toward the bank of elevators in comfortable, victorious silence. Mitchell pressed the call button, adjusting his tie. You handled that with remarkable restraint, Mitchell noted, keeping his eyes on the digital floor indicator above the elevator doors. I have seen grown men throw punches over far less. Restraint is easy when you hold all the cards, I replied, watching the numbers tick upward. The elevator chimed and the brushed steel doors slid open. We did not step inside. Instead, we stepped back to make room for the two federal marshals exiting the car. They were wearing dark, tactical gear, their faces grim and strictly professional. The lead marshal held a thick manila folder containing an active federal arrest warrant. They walked directly past us, marching straight down the hallway toward the glass-walled mediation room. I watched as they pushed through the doors. I watched Bradley finally snap out of his catatonic state, his eyes going wide with pure terror as the marshals commanded him to stand up. I watched as they pulled his arms behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs securing his wrists, sealing his fate. Sylvia stayed on the floor, weeping hysterically as her golden child was marched out of the room. We stepped into the empty elevator and the doors closed, cutting off the view of their complete destruction. The ride down to the lobby was smooth and silent. When I walked out of the skyscraper and onto the bustling city street, the afternoon sun felt incredibly warm against my skin. The air tasted cleaner. The heavy, toxic shadow that had followed me since childhood was completely gone, burned away by the harsh light of accountability. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an automated notification from the Regional Banking Authority. The asset freeze on Sylvia's accounts had been officially executed. The bank had initiated the immediate seizure of her estate to cover the fraudulent loan. She currently possessed zero liquid capital. I swiped the notification away and opened my contacts, dialing the foreman of my construction crew. It was time to break ground on the aquifer. The real work was just beginning. The drive from the downtown mediation center to the mountain took just under an hour. By the time Mitchell and I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the Wilson Mountain Resort, the transition of power was already in full aggressive effect. A white county sheriff cruiser, its light bar flashing silently, was parked directly under the massive timber portico of the main entrance. I stepped out of Mitchell's sedan, taking a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. Sheriff Davis, a man who had known my father for decades and respected him immensely, was waiting by the heavy oak doors. He tipped his uniform hat to me, a silent but clear acknowledgement that the emergency eviction notice I had filed that morning was fully authorized and actively being executed. We walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the grand lobby. It was a cathedral of vaulted ceilings, exposed riverstone, and massive glass windows. Right in the center of the expansive room, Sylvia was orchestrating a complete meltdown. She was standing near the grand staircase, screaming at a terrified young bellhop. She was violently pointing at a towering stack of 4 massive Louis Vuitton steamer trunks, demanding that he carry them down to the loading dock immediately. The bellhop, clearly aware that management had frozen all resort operations and locked down the accounts, wisely refused to touch a single strap. Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his boots heavy on the polished slate floor. His voice was perfectly polite, but it carried the absolute unyielding authority of the law. "Sylvia, you need to step away from the luggage," Sheriff Davis instructed. Sylvia whipped around, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of panic and rage. "You work for the County Davis!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "You work for the taxpayers, and I am the largest taxpayer in this district. Tell this useless kid to put my bags in a car right now. You do not own those bags, Sylvia," I said, stepping out from behind the sheriff. She froze. Her eyes darted toward me, completely bloodshot and wild. Every single item in those trunks, from the designer shoes to the diamond tennis bracelets, was purchased using a corporate credit card tied directly to the resort's operational fund. I explained calmly, my voice echoing off the high stone walls. "You treated this business like a personal slush fund. Now that the accounts are frozen and under federal review, everything purchased with stolen resort money is classified as seized evidence. It stays here." Sylvia let out a sound that resembled a cornered animal. She lunged toward the closest trunk, trying to wrap her arms around the leather exterior. "This is my property," she screamed. "I am Sylvia Wilson. I built this place. You cannot take my clothes." Sheriff Davis did not blink. He simply signaled to 2 large deputies standing by the front desk. They crossed the lobby in seconds, flanking Sylvia on both sides. Their expressions were utterly stoic. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his tone dropping an octave, "you can take one standard carry-on bag containing basic personal garments, nothing with a designer label, nothing purchased with corporate funds. You can walk out of this lobby under your own power right now, or my deputies will carry you out in handcuffs for criminal trespassing. Choose quickly." The remaining fight drained out of her instantly. The sheer public humiliation of being threatened with arrest in her own lobby finally broke through her delusion. She shakily grabbed a small, unbranded black duffel bag from the floor. Her knuckles were stark white. Without looking at me, she marched toward the exit, flanked closely by the 2 deputies. I followed them out the double-glass doors and onto the massive cobblestone courtyard that overlooked the valley. A sudden heavy hush had fallen over the exterior grounds. Directly above us, wrapping around the entire second floor, was the luxury spa balcony. 4 women in plush white resort robes were standing near the glass railing. They were Sylvia's elite country club friends, the same women she had hosted for lavish, entirely comped weekends for the last 5 years. They had been sipping champagne on the house while Sylvia bankrupted the resort. Sylvia looked up and spotted them. Her face lit up with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Eleanor!" she yelled up to the balcony, waving her free hand frantically. "Eleanor, call the club president. Tell them what this ungrateful girl is doing to me. They are trying to steal my property." The women did not rush to her defense. They did not shout back in outrage. They simply stood at the glass railing and stared down at her. One of the women leaned over to whisper something into Eleanor's ear, her face twisting into a highly visible mask of pure disgust. Without a single word, the 4 women turned their backs, walked away from the railing, and slid the glass balcony doors shut behind them. They abandoned her instantly. Sylvia let out a choked gasp, the rejection hitting her harder than the eviction itself. Before she could even process the humiliation, the heavy glass doors of the lobby violently swung open again. Bradley stormed out onto the cobblestones. He had clearly managed to slip away from the downtown mediation center before the marshals arrived and rushed back to the mountain, likely attempting a desperate cash grab from the main office safes. He was moving frantically, keys jingling in his hand, making a direct panicked line for a black rental truck parked illegally in the fire lane. He never made it to the driver's side door. 3 men wearing navy blue windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in stark yellow across the back stepped out from behind the heavy truck. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. The lead agent did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stepped directly into Bradley's path, grabbed him by the shoulder, and spun him hard against the side of the truck. Bradley slammed against the metal door. The sharp, heavy ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed loudly across the quiet mountain courtyard. "Wait!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "It was my wife, Kendra. Set me up. I have money. I can pay the fines. Just let me make a phone call. You have the right to remain silent." The lead agent stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he tightened the cuffs. "I highly suggest you start using it." Bradley did not fight back. He slumped against the side of the rental truck, crying openly and loudly as the agent read him his rights regarding multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. They shoved him into the back of an unmarked dark sedan and drove away down the mountain, leaving nothing but the faint smell of exhaust in the crisp air. I walked back under the timber portico, watching the final piece of the collapse play out perfectly. The sheriff's deputies had escorted Sylvia all the way down the long, winding driveway to the main public highway, officially clearing her from the private property line. She was standing on the dirty gravel shoulder of the road, over a mile away from the grand entrance, clutching her single piece of cheap luggage. The harsh mountain wind was whipping her perfectly styled hair into a tangled, chaotic mess. Through the distance, I could see her frantically tapping the screen of her cell phone. She held it to her ear, waited, then lowered it to dial again. She was calling the country club. She was calling the charity board members. She was calling the women from the balcony. I stood under the shadow of my resort and watched as she dialed number after number, standing completely alone on the side of the highway as the realization finally crushed her. Not a single person in her entire elite universe was ever going to answer her call again. That afternoon on the gravel shoulder of the highway was the last time I ever saw Sylvia in person. The seasons changed, the harsh mountain winter giving way to a bright, relentless spring. And with that transition came the absolute systematic dismantling of the empire my mother and brother had tried to steal. The wheels of justice, once set into motion by undeniable proof, turned with a terrifying and magnificent speed. 6 months later, Sylvia's reality had become unrecognizable. The regional bank had shown zero mercy regarding the defaulted $5 million construction loan. They seized the sprawling country club estate, liquidating the imported furniture, the luxury cars, and the designer wardrobes at public auction. Sylvia was stripped of her status, her assets, and her meticulously crafted identity. She now lives in a rundown extended-stay motel on the industrial outskirts of the county. The neon sign outside her window flickers with a persistent electrical buzz, casting a harsh pink glow over a room that smells permanently of stale smoke and cheap disinfectant. She has no offshore accounts left to drain. She has no rich husband to manipulate. She was forced to pawn the few unbranded pieces of jewelry the sheriff allowed her to keep, just to cover her weekly rent. Her former high society friends, the women who used to drink her champagne on the spa balcony, now actively cross the street if they spot her walking toward the discount grocery store. She is a total pariah, entirely cut off from the elite world she once ruled with an iron fist. She has become exactly what she always mocked. Bradley met an even swifter and more brutal fate. The federal court system operates with devastating efficiency when handed a perfectly organized, categorized, and fully audited digital confession. Kendra's forensic accounting was a silver bullet. Bradley's high-priced defense attorneys took one look at the encrypted flash drive and immediately advised him to plead guilty. The prosecution refused to offer a single concession. During his sentencing hearing, Bradley stood before the federal judge wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his tailored suits and his overwhelming arrogance. The judge cited his forgery, his wire fraud, and his blatant embezzlement before handing down a heavy multi-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. There are no golf courses where he is going. There are no valet parking pavilions. He is serving hard time, completely separated from the luxury he believed was his birthright. Kendra, on the other hand, did not just survive the fallout. She weaponized it to build her own empire. The divorce proceedings were swift and entirely in her favor. She secured full physical and legal custody of her son, ensuring he would never be exposed to the toxic manipulation that defined the Wilson family tree. Moving back to Manhattan, she launched her own boutique consulting firm specializing in corporate fraud detection and forensic auditing. Her reputation skyrocketed. Major corporations now pay her exorbitant consulting fees to hunt down the exact kind of financial parasites her ex-husband tried to be. Just last week, I received a custom holiday card in the mail. It featured a beautiful photograph of Kendra and her son smiling brightly in Central Park. Inside, she had written a short handwritten note expressing her gratitude for that day in the mediation room. "We will never be best friends, but we share a profound unspoken respect. We are two women who looked at a burning building and decided to grab a fire hose instead of running away. While my mother and brother faced their respective ruins, I poured every ounce of my energy into the mountain." The environmental crisis Bradley created on his second day was entirely resolved, funded ironically, by his own greed. Federal prosecutors managed to locate and seize the last of his hidden offshore gambling accounts. The United States Attorney's Office applied those seized funds directly to the $2.8 million EPA penalty. With the fines fully paid, I hired a team of top-tier environmental engineers and ecological restoration experts. We used the remaining seized money to meticulously repair the torn earth, stabilizing the soil, and replanting the ancient woods that Bradley had recklessly bulldozed. The federal conservation easement is now fully protected and thriving, serving as a beautiful natural barrier on the eastern perimeter of the property. I officially rebranded the property as The Haven. It opened 3 months ago to absolute critical acclaim. Without the dead weight of Sylvia's vanity projects or Bradley's gross mismanagement, the resort is operating at peak efficiency. We are fully booked for the next 2 calendar years. Guests pay premium rates to experience the luxury spa, the pristine hiking trails, and the breathtaking views of the valley. And beneath it all, flowing silently under the restored earth, is the massive unmapped aquifer tied exclusively to Lot 4B. I control the water rights. I control the lifeblood of the Western Ridge. My father was right. That rusted maintenance shack, sitting on 500 square feet of dirt, was the most valuable asset in the entire county. I sit at my father's old mahogany desk in the main executive office, looking out through the massive glass windows at the bustling resort courtyard. Valets are greeting guests, the timber portico gleams in the afternoon sun, and the air is filled with the sounds of a thriving, successful enterprise. My father's recorded voice often echoes in my mind. He told me to build my empire on the water and to never let my mother or brother know until it was too late. I followed his final instructions perfectly. I protected his legacy. I removed the parasites who tried to bleed it dry, and I secured my own future on incredibly solid ground. The Wilson family curse has finally been broken, washed away entirely by the deep, clear waters running right beneath my feet. I closed the heavy leather ledger on my father's old mahogany desk. The final numbers for the quarter were not just good, they were completely unprecedented. The Haven was not simply surviving, it was actively dominating the luxury hospitality market in the region. We had waiting lists extending into the next calendar year, and the local press could not stop writing glowing reviews about our ecological restoration initiatives. I stood up, smoothing the soft cashmere of my beige sweater over my tailored linen trousers. It was a stark contrast to the stiff, uncomfortable corporate armor Sylvia had always tried to force me into. She believed that power was projected through sharp edges, heavy makeup, and aggressive branding. I had learned that true power allowed you to breathe comfortably in your own skin. I preferred elegance that felt like freedom. Walking over to the corner wet bar, I uncorked a bottle of deep red Cabernet and poured a single measure into a heavy crystal glass. I carried the wine across the expansive office and pushed open the double glass doors leading out onto the private executive balcony. The evening air was crisp and incredibly clear, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the faint, earthy aroma of the restored wetlands on the eastern perimeter. Below me, the main cobblestone courtyard of the Haven was bathed in the warm golden glow of the setting sun. Valets in neat uniforms were assisting arriving guests, taking their luggage with genuine smiles. The gentle melodic murmur of relaxed conversations and the soft clinking of silverware drifted up from the outdoor dining terraces, A familiar white county cruiser rolled slowly up the main drive, coming to a gentle stop near the valet stand. Sheriff Davis stepped out of the vehicle. He was not there for an emergency or to deliver a warrant. He was simply doing a routine community check-in, likely grabbing a coffee from our lobby cafe before his night shift officially began. I watched him from the balcony, remembering how things used to be. For years, this man had been forced to cater to Sylvia's every hysterical whim. She used to call his personal cell phone to complain about minor traffic delays on the highway or to demand that deputies remove local hikers who dared to park too close to the property line. She had treated local law enforcement as her own privately funded security firm, constantly threatening their pensions and their budgets if they did not instantly comply with her outrageous demands. Now, the dynamic was entirely different. I was not just the owner of the resort. I was the largest employer in the entire district and the highest contributor to the county tax base. I had funded a new community outreach center downtown and ensured that all my staff received full health benefits. I had not bought the town's loyalty. I had earned its respect. As Sheriff Davis turned back toward his cruiser, he glanced up and caught sight of me standing on the balcony. He stopped, stood perfectly straight, and respectfully tipped his uniform hat up toward me. I offered a slow, slight nod of acknowledgement in return. He got back into his cruiser and drove down the mountain, leaving my sanctuary perfectly secure. I leaned against the thick glass railing, taking a slow sip of the Cabernet. I looked out over the sprawling 50 acres of pristine mountain property. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely free of the toxic noise that had infected my entire childhood. Society loves a neat, predictable redemption story. People expect that eventually time will heal all wounds, that blood ties will magically summon a tearful cinematic family reunion. The cultural expectation is that one day I will drive down to that cheap, flickering industrial motel, knock on Sylvia's door, and pull her into a forgiving embrace. They expect me to put money on Bradley's commissary account and visit him in the visiting room of his federal penitentiary to tell him all is forgiven. But I feel absolutely zero obligation to fulfill those toxic expectations. There will be no forced forgiveness. There will be no awkward holiday dinners filled with empty apologies, veiled insults, and hidden daggers. I refuse to set myself on fire just to keep them warm. I survived the designated role of the family scapegoat. I was the quiet punching bag meant to absorb their failures, the convenient target meant to distract from their own staggering inadequacies. But I did not just survive that role. I used the heavy stones they threw at me to lay the foundation of an impenetrable fortress. They are never getting inside these walls again. True peace requires incredibly firm boundaries, and mine were forged in absolute steel. Below the surface of the perfectly manicured lawns and the tall, successfully replanted ancient woods, the deep underground aquifer flowed silently. It was the absolute lifeblood of the valley, pure and untainted, and it belonged entirely to me. I had taken a patch of dirt they deemed completely worthless and turned it into an empire that sustained hundreds of livelihoods. I had done it with my own vision, my own relentless resilience, and the single brilliant weapon my father had left me. My father had seen the massive value hidden beneath the dirt when everyone else only saw a rusted shack. More importantly, he had seen my value when the rest of the world only saw a target. He knew I had the spine to do what he could not. The sun dipped lower behind the mountain ridge, casting brilliant fiery streaks of orange and violet across the vast sky. The light perfectly reflected off the glass facade of the resort, making the entire building glow. I held my wine glass tightly, feeling the cool crystal against my skin. I looked up at the vibrant, darkening clouds, feeling a profound and permanent sense of peace settle deeply into my chest. Cassidy raises her glass to the sky. "You were right, Dad. I built the empire." Fade to black. The story of Cassidy's triumph over her toxic family teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and resilience. We often believe we must endure mistreatment from relatives simply because we share blood. However, true power and peace come from setting unyielding boundaries and refusing to be anyone's scapegoat. Cassidy did not seek revenge through petty arguments. She secured her future through strategic planning, absolute accountability, and building her own unbreachable empire. By detaching from her mother's conditional approval, she finally claimed her independence and self-respect. Take control of your own narrative today and share your experiences in the comments below.